I wonder if you could share with us your perspective on this.
So that's a great example. So what we're talking about is that being able to return the first stage in this case, and eventually the entire launch vehicle to the launch pad and reuse it several times. So for those who don't know, in the traditional and in fact all operational systems today, with the exception of SpaceX, and now we're seeing Blue Origin and others coming online, basically the payload that makes it to orbit, whether it's a satellite or a spacecraft or whatever, is probably less than 5% of the mass and the cost that you leave the ground with. And the rest of it ends up in the ocean at the bottom of the Atlantic or the Pacific. So it's a really interesting model to really change the paradigm about, we have known for a long time, to really change the cost structure of space exploration, the price of getting into space. We really have to solve that problem. Nobody would set up an airline where I use an airplane one time and throw it away. That's just not a feasible solution. You can imagine the ticket prices, right? Yeah. So that's been something that we have actually been working on for a long time. Many very capable people in industry and at NASA have tried to work this problem. And so the barrier has been less, it turns out, about maybe a physics barrier and more about sort of a mental, cultural barrier. And the situation is this: all of us who grew up in aviation, I'm a pilot, the first thing you learn is when landing an airplane, you want to achieve a stabilized approach, meaning you have a constant rate of descent, constant vertical velocity, constant velocity, setting up a stable approach to the runway. You do that because once you're in a stable configuration, if anything doesn't look right, you have the opportunity to abort and go around and try it again. So that's a practice that's embedded in our consciousness from the beginning. So when we design vehicles that land, whether it's a first stage or it's a lander on the lunar surface, in this case of Apollo, we follow that paradigm. We design the trajectory so that we arrest all the velocity, get rid of all the energy that we have, set up a constant approach, and then for the last minute or so, we're on a very slow descent, very stable descent towards the surface. The problem with that is it takes a certain amount of fuel to lose all the velocity you have, all the energy that you have if you're returning from orbit or whatever, and that takes a certain amount of energy. And then for the next 2 minutes while you're in a vertical descent, that takes almost the same amount of energy. So you're actually maybe doubling the fuel quantity that you use. And this is the way everybody has gone at this problem, and it turns out it's just too much fuel. It's prohibitive. And Elon, not being from that tradition, Elon Musk and SpaceX simply turned the problem on its head, and they just said, well, the output that I want, the performance that I want, is to be at zero velocity just before I hit the ground. And what is the last second, if I work that problem backwards, if my engines are slowing me down and just before I hit the ground, I achieve zero velocity. What is the last second that I can turn those engine on to deplete all that energy? And it turns out if you work the problem backwards, you end up with about half the fuel. And that's why he's been successful where nobody else has been. There's no new physics, there's no new propulsion system, no magic. It's a mental paradigm about how you work a problem. That it turns out those who maybe don't know what can't be done because they don't have a legacy of decades in an industry can come up with a completely different way to approach a problem. And that's a great example, I think.
Thank you. So it's a game-changing
very much
technology.
So. Yes, very much so.
And the principle for innovation, as you said, is being able to see an established problem in a new way.
Yeah.
And try to not be blinded by your own paradigm.
Yep. And I think it's another thing that you could extrapolate to any industry, because it's really interesting. I've mentioned to you before, one of the things I tell young people when I talk to younger people, they ask me what, for advice, I always tell them, act like you don't know what can't be done. The reason the Apollo team were so successful in 1960 in doing something that had never been accomplished before, never been attempted before, is that it was composed mostly of 20-something-year-old engineers that really had very little experience. Nobody had experience. Nobody had flown in space, right? Yuri Gagarin and the Russian team had just done something a year before. But other than that, there was no textbook. And these guys were literally inventing the solutions on the fly. So they weren't handicapped by any a priori knowledge of what can't be done. And I think you could say that maybe the same spirit that you see in companies like SpaceX, in companies like Blue Origin and so on. And it's a very interesting, I think, phenomenon that's very hard to duplicate in established companies, because you develop corporate knowledge that may actually, you do know what can't be done. And that knowledge may be very relevant and very true in a certain context, but as the environment changes, as the conditions change, it may no longer be true, but it persists in corporate knowledge.
And so some companies will create their innovation labs away from the main organization precisely for this reason,
Exactly.
or will have networks with universities and other organizations.